Welcome to the Art Fisher Brothers podcast, episode 6, I believe. This is another series that we are tackling on two American pillars of filmmaking. One of the greats, Steven Spielberg, and one of the other greats, Martin Scorsese. Double S's.
Yeah, undoubtedly the preeminent filmmakers of the last half of the 20th century, and still to this day, two of the most prestigious filmmakers still working.
There's something to be said for both of them, considering when they both had their starts. I mean, we mentioned how they kind of ran in the same circle as such filmmakers as George Lucas, Brian De Palma, Francis Ford Coppola, just to name a few. But what separates these two from them is that the way that they are so prolific nowadays, and I don't want to say continue to be, but their movies continue to be. And we'll take a look at each of them and what their work does for cinema, and what separates each from one another.
Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty accurate description of them. Like, Spielberg is the highest grossing filmmaker ever. His movies have been watched by more people than any other, at least in theaters. Whereas Scorsese has kind of become more popular the longer he's gone on. And now, I mean, they're both living legends, but Scorsese's enjoyed a bit more success in the last 20 years or so. Probably equivalent to Spielberg, but Scorsese isn't making blockbusters today. In fact,
You mean that the end result is not a blockbuster, but also that he is not setting out to make a blockbuster?
he's not.
Both?
Scorsese is not the one that's getting $100 million to make his movies. I think The Irishman was probably one of his most expensive movies to date.
Especially because of the digital aging that they added, right? I would imagine that cost a ton.
Yeah. Like, I think probably the last 8 or 9 movies Scorsese have made have been his biggest movies in terms of how much they cost and how much money they made. Like, they're more in the blockbuster category. And we'll get into that over time, how Spielberg created the blockbuster, like created these movies that were events to go see in theaters. While Scorsese was making a lot of, they're not independent movies, but much smaller budgeted movies. Like, through the 70s and 80s, his movies cost, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million to make. Spielberg was making the most expensive movies at their time, on par with the likes of, James Cameron.
Yeah. I was actually about to mention James Cameron in that vein. I think some people honestly get them confused. Like the Titanic just came to mind, and that's not Spielberg. It's Cameron.
Yeah, so we can discuss that before we get into the specifics, or before we get into history, sort of the hallmarks of these filmmakers.
Yeah.
Both technically, story-wise, the types of projects that they seem to go towards. Because unlike a lot of the other filmmakers we'll probably end up talking about on this podcast, these two are not as well known for being writers. They're primarily directors. They're not writer-directors. They're more of the producer side of things. So I think both of them have written quite a few screenplays and have definitely, made significant decisions on the stories that they're telling. But by and large, they're either working directly with writers that they've worked with for a long time, or they're just being signed on to a big studio project where it's already been written.
Right. Spielberg, I would imagine, is more, I don't want to say more sought after or more sought out than Scorsese. I feel like Scorsese does more of the sifting through for like a very specific movie, whereas Spielberg does a whole mix of different genres and types of movies. Do we want to get into like sort of what their lasting maybe legacy or what their lasting impact is from their movies at this point, or do we want to wait till the end?
We can do that in the end.
Okay.
I think we'll have a better idea after talking about them what sort of that legacy is. I mean, by and large, you could probably categorize them by um, Spielberg having made two major types of movies through his career, which are either fun action, science fiction, fantasy, adventure movies.
Adventure definitely sticks out.
Yeah, primarily adventure, because you could like take a lot of his early work and categorize all of it basically as an adventure movie. And that was definitely what he became famous for through the 70s and 80s, and then continued to make into the 90s. Whereas Scorsese primarily has made, I mean, through that same period of time, a varied amount of works. Like some of them are just very small dramas. Like a lot of his early movies are just smaller dramas, and they focus on very different, very specific things. Um, before kind of getting into some more really offbeat movies like King of Comedy or After Hours. I mean, Scorsese, I think, is one of the first people who's described working within the studio system as being like a one for you, one for me deal. Where being able to work for these big studios means they'll give him a movie they want him to make, and then he gets to pick a project he wants to do.
Right. I don't really get the sense of that with Spielberg.
If there is one, yeah, it's hard to say where that line exists, because I feel like he was as invested in making Jurassic Park 2 as he would have been with making, uh, Catch Me If You Can.
Yeah, and what's also interesting about both of their bodies of work is that there's almost some like blending of techniques, but also of what techniques I mean is like film techniques, but then also narrative techniques that at times, if you're watching a movie from Spielberg, at times it reminds you of Scorsese and vice versa. You mentioned Catch Me If You Can. At times that does feel like parts of it were from a Scorsese movie as well. I mean, it also has Leo in it, who is featured in a number of Scorsese's later works. But they definitely have sort of a cross between them in some capacity.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, especially if you consider that DiCaprio was working with Scorsese on Gangs of New York and The Aviator and The Departed and then Shutter Island, and like in between that, he did Catch Me If You Can with Spielberg. And part of that is just a byproduct of the fact that he was, the A-list actor at that moment in time, through the late 90s into the early 2000s, and continued to be because of his work with Spielberg, I would argue.
Certainly, certainly. So, do we want to start at the beginning for both of them?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, these guys both started working as filmmakers around the same time in the late 60s. They both released movies, like directed movies in the 60s. Movies now that are not well known. Like, I think Spielberg's first movie was made in like 64, and is like an amateur film.
How old was he when that came out?
17.
20 something? 17.
Yeah.
Nice.
But this is like not a real movie.
Yeah.
Um like I think it costs like $500 to make.
For those listening, what's the name of it?
Firelight.
Go ahead and check it out.
Yeah,
If there's even a way of watching
I
it.
think it's basically just like a very small, almost proof of concept, like movie made by children that would become Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
I see.
Whereas Scorsese started making a movie called Who's That Knocking on My Door? Yeah, which is like a crazy drama, I guess I would call her.
Okay.
It's a lot about like the role that sex plays in a like highly Catholic household.
That sounds extremely Scorsesean.
Yeah, but there's lots of scenes where Harvey Keitel is calling a lady a whore, and some discussions about rape and other rather extreme situations.
Nice, Martin.
Yeah, but basically both of them broke through around the same time.
Early 70s,
I
mid
would say
70s.
mid 70s, yeah, with Scorsese being put on the map by Mean Streets and then becoming internationally known because of Taxi Driver. Whereas Spielberg made Jaws, and then from there on out, it was pretty much just hits for Spielberg.
Yeah, Jaws was 75, right?
Yeah. Jaws is like the first huge blockbuster movie. Like it beat Star Wars even.
Damn.
Obviously now Star Wars is bigger,
Yeah.
but a lot of people credit The Exorcist with being sort of the beginning of the blockbuster because it was the first like major event movie that people went to see in theaters.
Who did that one?
William Friedkin.
That's right. And that came out in 70? 71?
73.
Okay, 73. Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, what a time for film, the 70s.
Yeah. Yeah, so the 70s were like the beginning of like the new Hollywood era. So a handful of sort of auteur-driven filmmakers, the likes of Spielberg and Scorsese, but also people like Brian De Palma, Francis Ford Coppola. You could throw William Friedkin in there, George Lucas.
These are the guys
They were all
who took over the mantle of old Hollywood. Like, this is
essentially,
neo
yeah.
Hollywood. And what's interesting is I would say Spielberg and Scorsese is sort of who people turn to nowadays for their thoughts on film, but also the thoughts on like the direction of a film, like where it's going, especially Scorsese.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, because the 70s were defined by a period where a lot of those filmmakers were allowed to make whatever they wanted. Like they were being given huge chunks of money to go out and make, these vision based projects. And once that ended at the end of the 70s due to a movie called Heaven's Gate, that kind of went on to shape what Scorsese's career would be like for a while. Because Spielberg, like, once he got started, it never stopped for him. Like, he just entered the studio system and, like, took the thing over.
Right.
Kind of with the help of George Lucas, who would, as soon as George Lucas had a taste of success, he just sold out immediately, like, as quickly as humanly possible. He abandoned any sort of like artistic intent or integrity.
Like he was able to identify what the people wanted and then just give it to them. Is that what you're saying?
No, he just searched for the way to commercialize filmmaking to the greediest extent.
I see what you're saying.
Like he was someone in the 70s who was has tons of interviews where he's like, I just want to make little independent art house type movies. And then he made Star Wars and made a bajillion dollars, and then was like, what if we made sequels where I literally write characters that are just merchandising opportunity? Which Spielberg would go on to dabble in for the rest of his career, but would not be as defined at it as George Lucas, who basically just stopped directing. Like, George Lucas didn't even direct the Star Wars sequels.
That is true. Something that I think people fail to realize.
Um, but yeah, these early, just to sort of give a breakdown of these early movies between the two of them, I would say Scorsese's most well known from the 70s are Mean Streets and Taxi Driver. Um, Mean Streets has now been done an infinite number of times, but it's kind of credited as being one of those early, like, American gangster movies, American crime movies that sort of defined the genre. Um,
An even younger Robert De Niro than Taxi Driver, as De Niro is just casually in Mean Streets.
yeah, so that was the movie that made him start to grow very famous, and then Taxi Driver made him extremely famous.
Yeah, and then you have on the flip side of that, you have Spielberg with Jaws, which is sort of a blend, I would say, of a movie that endures even now. I mean, I have students who have seen a number of iconic movies, and I ask at various times, like, who has seen Jaws? And in every single class, a number of kids' hands come up, which is surprising considering that movie did come out, basically 50 years ago, which is pretty crazy to think about.
Oh yeah, it is aged super well. Like, you can say whatever you want about how silly the shark might look, but that movie is like expertly shot, expertly paced. It's a great script.
as for what I was gonna say, it being a blend of, it's a blend of like a family experience while also like suspenseful, right? Like, I mean, in our family, it's heralded by mom as being like a great sort of like movie to watch. That this is a deeper discussion that I'm going to get into about Spielberg, but I think his stories are sort of like a bridge from you being a kid into being an adult. Like, his movies offer that, from maybe like a scary standpoint, but then also like not quite into like over the line violence, but like just enough violence where you're like, oh, this is not a kid's movie anymore. And then he blends in the family experience in that as well. But yeah, I mean, the pacing in that movie is just beat by beat perfect. The zooms are just like wildly creative and iconic.
Oh yeah, the perfected the dolly zoom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, popularized by Hitchcock, and then yeah, Spielberg would go on to use it frequently. I mean, there's also it's called now like the Spielberg Oneer, which is just like really great long takes,
Mm.
which he used fairly frequently in Jaws to excellent effect. But yeah, that what you touched on there is how he's able to blend a lot of like moments of different genres together, like these elements of horror that just show up in Jaws or Close Encounters or even Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom, because they are family friendly kids movies, kind of. Like, Jaws is
Yeah.
pretty scary for kids because there are kids who get eaten by a shark.
It's fine.
But then they
They
blow up the
gotta
shark
learn
at the
somehow.
end. So, but it's also it can be always be appreciated by any kind of adults. Probably more for men because they're just these big burly sailor dudes, and or dude in particular, the Robert Shaw or whatever his name is.
25 men go into the water that one day. Yeah, just the alcoholic guy who can only deal with the world through dark liquid.
Yeah. Uh, Getting off track here, thinking about Jaws.
That's fine. I mean, Close Encounters comes soon after, which is just very defining for Spielberg, given that he goes from Jaws then to pretty much completely like sci-fi bridge movie.
Yeah, I prefer Close Encounters to the Star Wars, which came out the same year.
I remember enjoying Close Encounters. It probably, I think I saw it when I was too young. It freaked me out because he did the in that movie especially he did the thing where he shows you just enough where your mind fills in the gaps quite well, and he used practical effects similar to Jaws, um, really really well for you to be able to fill in how the movie is going and what is being shown to you.
Yeah, but that like basically as a like Scorsese has never made a science fiction movie, whereas Spielberg has made numerous of them.
Last
Um,
Temptation of Christ. It's not sci-fi.
no,
Oh, okay.
maybe fantasy, but not science
I,
fiction.
I thought it was. Sorry, got it
Um,
confused with something else.
but I mean, you can see a comparison between these guys as early as this point in time, where Spielberg is wanting to make these family pleasing movies, and Scorsese, like I would say, Taxi Driver defines his work up through the '70s, which is a gritty, violent movie with a I wouldn't say outright depressing ending, but a dark one for sure.
Yeah, it's quite a damning ending. And then on the flip side, breaking or bursting into the 80s, you then have Raging Bull from Scorsese, and then in 1980, and then Raiders of the Lost Ark in 81. Scorsese certainly takes this is certainly going to be a motif throughout, but he takes those the darker sides or the darker edges of things and really highlights them and draws those out. And then Spielberg, has a really really enjoyable, fun adventure movie with Indiana Jones.
Yeah, and it's odd because both of these movies are interested in a weird way in history, where Raging Bull is a biopic and it's about the history of this once great boxer through his whole life. And I mean, there's a lot of visual allusions to other films, film history, the boxing movies specifically. And this is something that both of them are concerned about, and it kind of echoes through a lot of their films. Is their own versions of history and their own interests in history. I mean, the character of Indiana Jones literally is interested in preserving history, which is something that Spielberg would go on to try to become, as he makes in recent times either just tons of remakes or he's just making historical dramas, trying to preserve these parts of history.
Yeah, and then after Raiders of the Lost Ark, he goes back into the sci-fi by hitting E.T., which is a perfect example of blending commercialism with a super popular movie with the Reese's Pieces, right? That are like trickled throughout.
Yeah.
Yeah, and instead of making a kids sci-fi movie, Scorsese makes King of Comedy.
Yeah, so while Spielberg is making through the 80s, like his 80s movies are Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is a big budget adventure movie, E.T., which is a big budget sci-fi kids movie, um, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, big budget adventure movie, um, and then Empire of the Sun, which is like a war movie kind of made for kids. versus Scorsese. So these movies all have pretty big budgets. Empire of the Sun doesn't, but the movies Spielberg's making at the same, or Scorsese's making at the same time, cost like $3 million, $4 million. Like they're small movies. Um, Basically, since the studio system started to crack down on filmmakers like Scorsese, not letting them make these big projects, not wanting their budgets to balloon and bankrupt the studios, he kind of had to work in that mode for a while. But Raging Bull, King of Comedy, After Hours, these are all excellent movies. I mean, Raging Bull received a ton of accolades when it came out, but it didn't commercially do that well. And King of Comedy and After Hours, I think, were disappointments commercially. I think they did all right critically for people at the time, but Scorsese then would go on to make The Color of Money and The Last Temptation of Christ, which just saying those titles out loud is funny. Because one of them is about a gambling pool player and the other one is literally about Jesus Christ's death.
Jesus Christ, the pool player.
Yeah. And
and that's to round out the 80s, right?
Yeah. So that's how Spielberg ended the 80s, or Scorsese ended the 80s, was with a deeply personal religious story about faith. Where Spielberg made The Last Crusade, which is a deeply personal story about faith.
Yeah.
It's just,
yeah. I mean, there are a few really iconic scenes in The Last Temptation of Christ as well as The Last Crusade. The Last Crusade in particular, I'm thinking about where there's that chasm, and in order to walk through and to find the Holy Grail, you have to step on nothing. Like you have to walk across the chasm, and there's nothing in between. It's just completely about faith.
But it's also a schlocky movie where they have a man who blows up a biplane by waving his umbrella and getting birds to go into the engines.
Right. It is also an adventure movie.
I think that's probably something people criticize about it today, is Sean Connery's just ridiculous, over-the-top schlock. Like this movie has a weird edge to it, almost akin to like Inglourious Bastards, like some kind of old like 50s action movie, like exploitation, where it's just like American heroes beating up Nazis.
Ah, yes. I certainly see that.
It's just funny that it culminates in the more touching moments at the end where Indiana Jones isn't looking for immortality. He literally just wants to like save his dad and make sure the Nazis don't confiscate basically a powerful magic artifact. And the consequences are the same way, like trying to use old faith to justify atrocities ends in the villains being just destroyed. Like Raiders of the Lost Ark is just, they literally melt, and then by the time The Last Crusade happens, it's just the man his hubris betrays him, and it just implodes, ages into implosion. I don't know how else you would describe what happens to that guy, but
yeah, very very similar ends in both of them. I was gonna say it's echoing that as well. And then shifting into the 90s for both of them, you have Scorsese with some good old family movies of Goodfellas, followed by Cape Fear, excellent family movies. And then Spielberg with the really visceral, violent Hook, Robin Williams' Hook. Obviously, I mean, these inverted. Hook is a nice family movie with Robin Williams and Is it Glenn? It's not Glenn Close. Who is it? Um, some woman actors in that movie. Um, I forget what character they play, but yeah, Goodfellas.
Julia Roberts is in Hook.
Maybe it's Julia Roberts. I don't remember.
Gwyneth Paltrow, Maggie Smith. Those are all in it. Phil
But
Collins.
no, it's not. It's not Genesis Man.
Phil Collins is in Hook.
It isn't that. Anyway, Goodfellas, an incredible gangster movie, and then Cape Fear, an extremely unsettling movie, which also has De Niro in it. A very tattooed criminal man. But yeah, that's them bursting into the 90s. And then after Hook comes Jurassic Park. Of Speaking of movies that have been overly commercialized and continue into nowadays, you have Jurassic Park on Spielberg's side, which came out in 1993, as well as the other movie he came out in 1993, Schindler's List, which is definitely one of his different movies for many different reasons. We talked about the history piece with Spielberg's interest in history and wanting to capture that, and I think this movie in particular, he did an excellent job in capturing the realism of this particular time, this particular story in many different ways.
Yeah, I think Schindler's List is definitely his best work. Just the most emotionally impactful, most powerful. Um, yeah, there's a lot to talk about with Spielberg's '90s work. I mean, he continues to make these family friendly movies, and he's already made two sequel movies. He's already made these three Indiana Jones movies. So then he makes Jurassic Park, which is a huge hit, and then he makes the sequel a few years later. And it's weird that at the same time he's making all of this, super populist filmmaking stuff, just appealing to the masses. He also makes The Color of Purple in the mid '80s, and then Schindler's List in the early '90s. Um, which really is branching out for him that he makes these. I'm sure it was a surprise to people when he made Schindler's List.
Certainly, it did win Best Picture, yes, as well.
Yeah, I'm certain of that. Yeah, I think he won Best Director and Best Picture and Best Writer. I think that just cleaned up at award ceremonies that year.
Yeah, a completely devastating film about a devastating time in in human history, which people obviously have a lot of mixed feelings about. Spielberg, people love all of his movies. People love Jurassic Park, Indiana Jones, what have you.
For me, this is the peak point for Spielberg. Like,
That's what I was gonna say. This is definitely the turning point, where I don't know if this movie changed him or made him only want to make like kind of movies for teenagers, but it seems like up to this point there were a number of movies that were like specific. I mean, we didn't even talk about how the Temple of Doom, that movie, and what was it, Gremlins, those are the movies that are the reason for the PG-13 rating coming out, because they were completely a bridge between PG and the R rating. Um, which my larger point is that like he before this essentially just had kids movies and movies for like teenagers. And then like The Color Purple and Schindler's List, and then Amistad. um, are certainly more in the adult section, and not in that they are like overtly, or not because they're extremely violent, but more so because of their like subject matter dictates that they are very serious. Like they're very serious movies, and they do have levels of violence that you have to have a mature perspective in order to handle and understand and grasp.
Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure Schindler's List is Spielberg's only R-rated movie.
I would assume so.
I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that is the case.
Based on this list, I think it is.
Yeah. So
Whereas Scorsese, I don't know how many of his are PG-13, but I would imagine most of them are R, PG-13 and R.
yeah, he was mostly making R-rated. I think some of his stuff from the 80s is PG. The Color of Money, I believe, is PG-13. But yeah, other than that, basically Hugo, I think, is his kids movie, and everything else is rated R. Aviator might be PG-13. But yeah, I think Scorsese like kind of ages really well. Like his movies just continue to get better and are interesting, and his vision never seems to go away. Whereas for Spielberg, yeah, 1993 is a turning point where like Schindler's List is about as good a movie as you can ask for with a historical drama, especially one centered around the Holocaust and the horrors of, you know, saving people. Redemption is a big part of that movie. Um, but at the same time, Jurassic Park is definitely the major turning point, because I don't think there exists a movie that is so self aware about itself being a merchandising opportunity. Like the movie is both trying to be entertainment and saying you shouldn't just commercialize everything. Like you can't commercialize science or there will be a problem with it.
Right, right. It is explicitly telling you that multiple
And then they
times.
would go on to make, 9 sequels to this thing. Just an endless amount of the second one directed by Spielberg, which is an okay movie. Like it's kind of suspenseful, but it definitely is a lead balloon on the original Jurassic Park, which is far superior.
A lead balloon.
Yeah. Yeah, Jurassic Park sequels are diminishing returns through and through.
Hmm. Yeah, that's certainly true. On the flip side, then, with Scorsese, after Cape Fear, which, if anyone hasn't seen that, that is a strong recommend from me. There were numerous times in that movie where my jaw dropped because I just wasn't expecting either the camera angle or whatever was happening to happen. And then there were some where I was like, oh, this is going to happen. And then it happened, and I was still just befuddled by what was currently being shown on screen. Talk about suspense and heart racing. Um, Casino, I a fine movie. It doesn't really do much for me personally. I'm not the biggest fan of Casino.
Well, it feels
Um,
almost redundant to Goodfellas, where De Niro and Joe Pesci give just these incredible performances in Goodfellas. Just in terms of like violent, sadistic, insane, paranoid characters, and then to go to Casino where there's more polish to them, and then the way that sort of varnishes off as the movie progresses, and they're forced into worse and worse situations, primarily due to Joe Pesci's character being a madman again. Yeah, it has less of a punch to it. It's more of a romantic movie in a weird way. Whereas Goodfellas is easily just described as crime doesn't pay, distilled down, even though it takes a childlike view of crime and says, wow, wouldn't you want to be in this life? Wouldn't you want the money and the respect and to be a part of this family? And then the way in which that perverts the protagonist, Henry Hill, down a road of, paranoia and violence. And then that ends with him turning on his own family. Yeah, I find Goodfellas to be more immediate. Based on the way that it's paced and edited, it just runs more smoothly, whereas Casino's a bit slower and a bit more drawn out.
Yeah, Goodfellas is long. I don't know the runtime comparison between them, but Goodfellas is long, but it never. I don't get bored or as bored with it. The pacing wise, Casino, yeah, Casino. I don't think I'll ever be able to watch again.
Casino is close to 3 hours. Goodfellas is not even 2.5.
That makes sense then. And then in approaching the 2000s, you have Kundun from Scorsese, and then breaking into the 2000s is Gangs of New York. And on the flip side, with Spielberg, you have AI in 2001 and Minority Report in 2002. So kind of like two different approaches here and going into the 2000s. Like Spielberg clearly is looking ahead, like in an imagined future. Scorsese is somewhat looking behind, right, with Gangs of New York.
Oh, exclusively behind. Yeah, Kundun, Gangs of New York, and Aviator are all historical epics / not really biopics, but definitely period pieces.
Yeah, I mean, also Spielberg has Catch Me If You Can in 2002, which is also taking place in the past, but it's the not so distant past. Minority Report, I enjoyed. Haven't seen AI, though I will probably be watching that soon. Yeah, Minority Report, the graphics don't seem to have held up well, but the story itself, I really like it for the story, I would say.
Yeah, the story is good, and it takes advantage of Tom Cruise's ability to kind of chew scenery and do just enough dramatic acting to pair between action scenes or suspense scenes or big set pieces with tons of green screens.
Colin Farrell always seems to hit well. He and his caterpillar eyebrows.
Yeah, the AI and Minority Report, I think, are some of the last times where Spielberg is experimenting with the green screen before it really begins to take over his movies in a way that
disrupts.
I would argue diminishes the impact.
Extremely disruptive, yeah. I would say.
Yeah, whereas Catch Me If You Can, we talked about this before we started. Catch Me If You Can feels like a movie that could have been made by Scorsese. Like it could have easily been made by either of them. Not only because it has DiCaprio, who is in just a ton of these 2000s and later Scorsese movies, but also just the subject matter. It's like Scorsese at this point is mostly just making crime movies with the occasional big spiritual drama. Like Last Temptation of Christ and Kundun are these very spiritual movies.
Well, it's hilarious that Leonardo DiCaprio is quite a thread here. I mean, Gangs of New York, Catch Me If You Can, Aviator, The Departed, Shutter Island. My God. Gangs of New York, going back to that, you have an absolute masterclass performance in Daniel Day-Lewis. Every time I watch that movie, he certainly is the piece that sticks out well. In that movie, I probably can't really watch again, only because I've seen it probably like 3 or 4 times. And yeah, I mean, Daniel Day-Lewis, I'm pretty good on it at this point. It's definitely too long, but yeah, I mean, Daniel Day-Lewis, what an actor in that.
Yeah, Daniel Day-Lewis ends up working with both of these guys.
Yep.
goes on to play Lincoln, titular character of the bloated
You didn't
historical
enjoy
drama
Lincoln?
Lincoln.
I thought it was pretty realistic.
Uh yeah, we can get into the the last or the most
We'll
recent
get
parts
there.
of
We'll
these
get
guys'
there.
careers where
But I want
uh
to skip over War of the Worlds and Crystal Skull.
yeah, these are the last I mean, Spielberg also makes Munich around the same time, which is like a good historic
I
drama,
think this is
sort
the
of a
territory where
thriller.
we get into your true feelings of Spielberg, at least nowadays.
Yeah, I mean Spielberg is a goat of some kind, like a greatest. He was at the top for a good 20 to 30 year
Is
period
he
as a
is he
filmmaker, just
Tom Brady
making
right now?
enduring. No, no, in not comparable to a an athlete because his career has just been too long. Um, but yeah, for as timeless as some of his work is from the 70s and 80s and definitely the 90s, the 2000s see Spielberg backsliding into a lack of creativity.
Just
And
putting out like what looks almost like what a robot would do, or like what someone who understands what a movie is, and they just come out with a movie.
I wouldn't say like War of the Worlds is not like technically poor. Like it still looks
No, I'm
pretty
not
good. And
sorry. I'm not asserting that. I'm more so asking that question. Yeah, I would agree with that.
I mean Crystal Skull is,
Crystal Skull, however,
yeah, I would argue heavily that Scorsese, other than maybe his first movie, maybe his first two movies, has not made a bad film at any point in his career. Um, but Indiana Jones, yeah, the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is just unfortunately a badly made movie, a badly conceived movie. Like it really only exists to profit off of existing intellectual property. A trend that I think Spielberg is definitely a part of in allowing the way that Hollywood makes movies today to proliferate into an unhealthy level.
hmm. Do you think Scorsese stands up to that? Like, do you think he is standing up to that?
I mean, every couple of years he comes out and shits on superhero movies and says that's not cinema.
Right, right.
I'm sure Scorsese has seen Kingdom of the Crystal Skull and was like, "Huh, what an odd picture."
What an odd choice,
I can't
Stephen.
I can't imagine him having anything good to say about the Shia LaBeouf with the monkeys scene. A scene that is just so it's brain shatteringly bad.
Yeah, it's interesting that just to backtrack to The Aviator and then The Departed. What a I mean that movie might be one of my favorites on both of these lists. Schindler's List certainly is up there. I do think that is Spielberg's best. Personally, I do enjoy Jaws. Jurassic Park is fun. I'm not so big a Jurassic Park person. Like I certainly appreciate the movie. I enjoy the movie, but Jaws and Indiana Jones, not the Crystal Skull one, are super enjoyable. But The Departed, for me, maybe it's because of the memes. Maybe it's because of just the intertwining of all of the characters, the acting in it as well, the time period. It all just it all just hits really, really, really well. You've got Leonardo DiCaprio, Jack Nicholson, Mark Wahlberg, Matt Damon. Uh, who else? Who else have we got in there?
Uh, Martin Sheen, Alec Baldwin.
Alec Baldwin.
A huge list of supporting actors too. Um, yeah, tons of really famous supporting actors.
Yeah, that movie is pretty near infinitely rewatchable for
Like
me.
what's his name? Ray Winstone,
Yes,
Anthony Anderson, who is
Anthony
actually
Anderson.
huge now. Yeah, Vera Farmiga is the only woman.
She's great in it. She's good, despite Scorsese not really knowing what to do with her and just kind of vilifying her completely.
Yeah,
And then the moving on from there to Shutter Island, and Scorsese has Hugo come out at this time, and Spielberg has Tintin come out in 2010. Scorsese's Hugo comes out in 2011. Both kids movies.
yeah. And Tintin, you know, a animated project, a version of like the Tintin story. Tintin is like a comic series, I believe, or a series of books, like adventure books, comics. Um, it's basically a soft reboot of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Correct.
Uh, Tons of similarities. Whereas Hugo is like a not only a departure for Scorsese, who had never made a kids movie up to that point, but Hugo is. It also attempts to take advantage of modern day technology. It was released in 3D some places and has all these big uh, animated set pieces, but at its core, the movie is about George Lumiere, one of the creators of camera and one of the first great filmmakers from like the turn of the 19th, 20th century. So at its heart, it's about, a child basically becoming fascinated with film and film history. So it has a deeper purpose, and I think is about a lot of things Scorsese cares about, which is the history of cinema and replicating that forward.
Do you think that transfers well to kids? Like, do you think kids would get that from watching it just based on the fact that we weren't kids when it was released?
Uh, I mean, maybe. I don't know. I don't know how many kids watched that movie and went, I'm gonna go look up this person to see what they were like in real. I don't
No, I didn't. You mean Lumiere or Scorsese?
either.
Yeah, I mean, Hugo being a kid's foray into Scorsese is quite comical. Mommy, what's Mean Streets? What's Taxi Driver?
Yeah, those are not movies for children.
And then post Hugo, you have from Scorsese, The Wolf of Wall Street in 2013, starring once again Leo, and Spielberg in 2012. 2012 to 2015, you have Lincoln in 2012 and Bridge of Spies in 2015.
Yeah, at this point, I would just wholesale compare everything they've done to each other since 2010. Like, you have
Mm-hmm.
Scorsese made five great movies about very different things. Like, Shutter Island is like a psychological thriller, false narrator stuff, heavily
Completely
dependent.
false narrative.
Yeah, lots of weird camera tricks to fool the audience. And then Hugo is a successful kids movie. Wolf of Wall Street is just a ridiculous balls to the walls,
Overly
more
produced.
modern day take of Goodfellas in a strange way. Crime doesn't pay, but it's more focused on Wall Street and predatory lending and greed, the need to have the most money, the need to do drugs, hedonistic pleasures.
If you haven't listened to our previous episode, we do go quite in depth with that. But yeah, this movie also does certainly, as we talked about before, inspire, I would say, our generation and generations to come to just kind of set out to do the thing that the movie is not necessarily saying to do, which is, go work for Wall Street, go make a bunch of money, go con some people, and the shady background of the way that the movie was produced. like where the finances came from is actually quite interesting.
Yeah, yeah, that's a whole nother aspect of it. But Silence and The Irishman are movies that feel like they're made by an old man. Definitely The Irishman. I mean, Silence is a much more methodical meditation on faith in the face of people who don't believe or don't want to believe or resent the fact that you even have faith at all. And The Irishman is just like, the feeling of aging and not really being recognized for what you did in your life about a hitman. But the basically my point in trying to rattle those off and describe them is they're not similar. None of them really feel similar, but they all have some hallmarks of Scorsese as a director in them. Whereas Spielberg's movies at this time are just, oh, they're all overlong. They all have these huge budgets. They're all kind of, some of them at least are Oscar bait type movies.
When you say Oscar bait, I know what you mean.
Yeah, they're movies that feel like they're made only to win awards. They don't feel like passion projects.
The Post, you didn't like The Post?
No, I think The Post is a thoroughly mediocre movie. Not only does it waste the talent of its huge ensemble cast, but it tells the story in an odd way that I think delegitimizes the outcome of what it was sort of talking about, which is the Pentagon Papers.
When did Spotlight come out?
2016.
That's what I thought. The Post was probably being produced at that time, but I would imagine it feels like a much worse version of Spotlight.
Yeah, The Post is a mediocre script. Spotlight is a really tight script.
Mm-hmm. Not that Spotlight is done by Spielberg or Scorsese.
No.
I just noticed the connection there.
But yeah, Warhorse, Lincoln, Bridge of Spies, and The Post, I would put all of them in that same category. They're all supposed to be historic. They're all way too long. They're paced very poorly.
Did they all do well?
They all did well. They all did phenomenal. They were all critical darlings. They were all commercial successes. And in between those, you have movies like BFG, Ready Player One, and Tintin, which are just like animated slogs made for children primarily. Ready Player One, to me, is like the death knell for Spielberg as a filmmaker. Like literally just the end of a great filmmaker's career. Because it's like Ready Player One, the book is already just a foray into how on earth do we mine nostalgia from all of pop culture and dilute it into one thing.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people who like that.
Yeah, people love nostalgia. So if you just put all the nostalgia in one place, people are going to love it.
It's interesting how The Irishman actually is kind of that as well, in a different way. Like, obviously, Ready Player One is a kid's movie. The Irishman is not a kid's movie, but The Irishman does blend a lot of nostalgic pieces into it, and is Scorsese talking directly to the audience in a lot of ways, from, as you mentioned before, like an old man's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, if you didn't like The Irishman, I can understand why, because it is ridiculously lengthed and very slow. Similar to the problems I had with some of these Spielberg movies. The difference is there is not another movie that Scorsese has made like The Irishman of this type. A very slow moving, but it takes place through time and through history. And it's meant to tell you something not only about that time period, but about Scorsese himself and, meta-narratively looking back on his own career through that time period.
I thought The Irishman was fine. It also, interestingly enough, kind of reminds me of Spielberg. Like, I think in a lot of ways it could have been a Spielberg movie, especially after the movies that you rattled off. Although I think it would be worse had Spielberg done it.
Yeah, I just don't think Spielberg cares anymore.
Gotcha.
Like if you watch Ready Player One, that it's not like that type of movie doesn't require a director. Like one thing I can't say about the movie, like it's a well rendered movie. They got those images on the computer to look pretty good. A lot of seamless action scenes of cars flying, and yeah, I abhor the ethos behind Ready Player One. Just this mismatch of nostalgia with things to come, virtual reality. And I mean, the whole point of the story is kind of a warning of like, we can't become too obsessed with nostalgia because it will consume us and we'll be forced into this VR nightmare forever. But then at the end of the movie, it's like, well, no, this stuff is important to us because this history is important. We just need to use it in moderation.
Good luck with that. Yeah, it seems to be quite a disconnect between that messaging and it's actually reinforcing what it's trying to say not to do.
Yeah, but that's like in terms of just going over these guys as broadly as we have, that's how I would define Spielberg is someone who came out of the gate strong, capitalized on his popularity to continue making these big budget action adventure family oriented movies, occasionally foraying into more serious stuff and then sort of tapping his career out on bloated, overproduced adventure movies and the exact same thing but for period dramas. Whereas Scorsese, I would argue, became more refined filmmaker over time, able to make stuff like Departed and Silence, within 10 years of each other. Where The Departed is, as raw and powerful as Goodfellas and Taxi Driver, and Silence is as meditative and strong as The Last Temptation of Christ or Kundun. Meaning that Scorsese still has the power to make high octane, fast moving gangster movies and spiritual ones. Like that level of balance, I think, is completely lost to Spielberg now. Like, I just have a really hard time swallowing the pill that, like, the guy had the same amount of passion for Crystal Skull, which was just a thoughtless cash grab, and then 5 years later be like, you know what I think is important for people to know? The most historically accurate portrayal of Abraham Lincoln possible. Like, the man is eating bowls of money with George Lucas, and then he's like, we need to make a good depiction of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, but people lap up whatever he sets out for them like cats to being fed by their master. Like whatever he puts out, people go watch, which is not necessarily the case for Scorsese. Obviously, The Irishman was a bit of a special case in that it came out like during the pandemic and was a
No, it was
Netflix.
before the pandemic.
It was a Netflix movie, right?
Yeah, but it was before the pandemic.
Like right before it, right?
Yeah,
It was 2019.
yeah, yeah. Whereas Steven Spielberg's pandemic release was the incredibly in poor taste remake of West Side Story.
Oh, I heard good things about it.
It's just yeah, I resent that movie a lot.
Why?
Well, first of all, I don't like the original. I think it's a mediocre musical at best. With a story that's just ripped straight from
Shakespeare?
yeah, Shakespeare. And the remake basically just it beat for beat is the same movie. It's just a little bit bigger. Like it has bigger set pieces to it, higher production value, and then it tries to take advantage of some currently popular social trends, making the movie about race. and class, which I mean, I think it originally is definitely about class, but this makes it more so about race and class and the connection between the two.
All right, I'm ready. Let's start to finish this episode by talking about Saving Private Ryan. And we're back. We skipped out on one of Spielberg's most iconic movies or most memorable movies, Saving Private Ryan, which came out in what year? Was it 97?
98.
98, okay. My feelings have changed about Saving Private Ryan in that I think it is a good movie, but uh, it certainly has diminished quite a bit for me in the last 10 years, I would say. It's not as high for me as other movies have become, is how I would explain it.
Definitely rides the line of like turning history into entertainment.
Yeah, war movies in general for me are tough. Um, for whatever reason, it may just be that I'm biased against them, but there are war movies that I do enjoy and I think are tremendously good. But for the most part, I don't find war movies to be particularly rewatchable. For the most part,
Yeah, I would agree with that.
so what would you like to say about Saving Private Ryan, other than it has a really interesting like intro sequence, like the not the one shot, but it's kind of like the one shot
Yeah, I mean them landing
method.
on Normandy is pretty memorable, just excellently executed sequence of war.
Among many people who were also executed on that day.
Yeah, I mean it's an odd movie in terms of like going in a 5 year span from the far more interesting and drama filled and sort of truth filled version of World War II with the Holocaust in Schindler's List. This is the, you know, in the trenches version.
Direction he took
No, this attempts to make an experience out of it, like a almost a theme park ride of war.
through a reasonably cumbersome story.
I don't think it's too cumbersome. The movie is pretty long. It's like 2.5 hours, but actually over 2.5 hours. But I mean, there's a lot of very memorable moments that are well executed.
I guess for me, the word that comes to mind with that movie is that it's fine. It's a fine movie.
I think it's a great movie. Um, yeah, I mean, I think there are elements of it that are, I wouldn't say dishonest, but because it does capture a lot of the brutality well. Like there's the sniper scene which goes on for a long time where it's just one guy shooting the main characters. Um, and then you have like the scene where they're like towards the end where the one guy gets stabbed, which is pretty brutal and has been done now hundreds of times in other movies.
Yeah, I mean, this movie certainly inspired many other war movies and moments in war movies that try to do it again, just not as well. So I guess that part is good about it in that it captures that aspect well. But yeah, I guess that's my problem with it is that the experience itself is strong. Um, but from like a film standpoint, technically, it's certainly like well created, well edited. I just from like a film standpoint, I just don't really get a whole lot out of it. I did when I first saw it. When I first saw it, I did,
I mean, I think it does. Like it.
but my feelings have changed on it.
Fair enough. I mean, I still associate it with being one of the more interesting World War II movies. Like it pales in comparison to um, stuff like Come and See, or even for a different war, Apocalypse Now.
Come and See, yeah. For anyone who is uninitiated in war movies, which if you think that Saving Private Ryan is the greatest war movie ever, then you have many international and foreign movies to consume, I would say.
Well, Come and See is just far more mature than this is. This pulls on the heartstrings of a certain type of nationalism and righteousness that doesn't exist at all in Come and See. I mean, it addresses those issues, but it's far more
Yeah, but it also just is
sadistic
like
and
America.
cynical. Yeah,
You've got to fight for America, which as a younger person, I certainly identified more with, but as not an older person because I haven't made it to 30 yet, but it's I just appreciate the movies that are more damning of the acts of war, I guess for me.
yeah.
Not to get too hung up on Saving Private Ryan, but I also feel like it was an extreme disservice not speaking about that movie and talking about Spielberg. And I hate to sound like I hate the movie because I don't hate it. Um, I think you can also learn a lot about filmmaking by watching that, taking notes on it.
Uh, yeah, yeah. I mean, I still think it's definitely a very worthwhile movie. Um, yeah. So I guess we're going to finish by just kind of ranking our favorite movies between these two guys.
And then talking about their sort of lasting impact between them.
Yeah, I mean, like for as much as I've sort of shit talked Spielberg, he is one of my favorite filmmakers. Like his movies of his that I like are profoundly good, not necessarily in a profound philosophical way or even an aesthetically pleasing way, but just in terms of commitment to quality filmmaking.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think for me also looking back at all of the movies that we talked about and didn't quite talk about as well, just the narrative form, the storytelling form, he does have down with his big punchy movies, his big punch movies. The story that unfolds and everything with it, he certainly captures well and brings some really incredible stuff out of the actors. The orchestration between all of the different pieces is at an all time high with some of these movies. Um, but that being said, as you mentioned before, it sort of falters more the later 2000s or after even the threshold of 2000.
So what is your number 10? Let's get into this.
Oh, just real antsy.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm ready. I
Well, the aforementioned Saving Private Ryan comes in at number 10 for me. And you?
For me it is Raging Bull.
How dare you? So just to fill in our audience, we did. I purposefully wanted this to be a surprise for both of us, so it could be more of a surprise for you as well, for you guys as well. Okay. Number 9. What's yours?
Saving Private Ryan.
All right. Mine is Wolf of Wall Street. As I said, I imagined these would be rather similar, just based on our viewing preferences and discussions on film as well. But
Yeah, I mean, The Wolf of Wall Street is my number eight.
Raging Bull is number eight.
Well, I guess we're
This
in
one,
full agreement.
this one might be a surprise for you for number seven, though. Cape Fear.
All right.
What do you have?
Silence.
I really was torn about throwing Silence on here, but
Yeah,
didn't.
I think it's criminally underrated.
I also feel that way, but I would like almost bump Saving Private Ryan with Silence. Then again, I guess that would match up with yours because you have it higher than Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah.
So number six.
Jaws.
Oh boy. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. I fucking love Jaws.
I do as well. I have Raiders of the Lost Ark at six. Number
All right.
five.
Number five, I have Goodfellas.
Imagine that. So do I.
Uh-oh, I have a feeling we're approaching similarity then.
Not with number four.
Number four, I have Raiders of the Lost Ark.
I have Jaws.
All right.
The top three are certainly the same. Like not sequentially, but what's number three? It might be the same.
The Departed.
Oh, a near miss. I have Taxi Driver.
All right.
I mean, as we talked offline about this, this could change depending on the day or the week. Number two, I have The Departed. Sorry, The Departed.
Number two, I have Schindler's List.
Oof. Oof.
Which I assume means that your number one is Schindler's List.
Yes. Yes. So you have what as number one? Taxi Driver?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I assumed would be your number one, but
Yeah, so pretty much we have the same thing with a couple switches in order other
Cape
than
Fear and
I have
Silence.
Silence and you have Cape Fear, yeah.
Those are the disruptors. Well, that was a really fun conversation.
You don't want to discuss why we would single out these 10 from
No, I was
the
going
the available 60 or so that we could have picked from.
No, I was saying that was a fun exercise. I look forward to doing this again with the rankings. Wow. Yeah. It's just quite an exercise trying to put them out. You should see all of the random scribbles I have of these. I mean, for me, Saving Private Ryan, we kind of just talked about as well. Wolf of Wall Street certainly hits a lot of different ideas for America, but also like it hits a lot of different like cultural buttons as well as like psychoanalytic buttons for me that I think work really well in that. The overproduction of it hits like a fine line for me where I don't know, something about the color and the costumes in that movie like really bother me. I understand what they're going for. We've talked about this before, but for whatever reason, it like kind of just breaks my brain. Like it's just continually reminding me like, oh yeah, this is not reality what you're watching. This is just a movie.
The Wolf of Wall Street?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's partially kind of like a documentary in the way that the narration drags you along, similar to Goodfellas, but Yeah, it becomes like hyper realistic a number of times. That and its use of comedy, which is very different from Goodfellas. I mean, we obviously have the same personal bent in terms of like largely enjoying Scorsese's crime movies the most,
Right.
like Examination of Criminals versus, by and large, Spielberg's best of adventure movies. And then we both agree that Schindler's List is the creme de la creme of drama stuff.
I almost said untouchable, but I don't want to bring another debate about a movie up.
Yeah, get that Brian De Palma out of here.
Raging Bull, another psychoanalytic piece of cinema, as well as continuing to touch on um, Lumiere and aforementioned directors as well who came before. It's sort of like there are many moments in that movie that are nods and salutes to people who have come before, and Scorsese does stand on the shoulders of giants in a lot of ways, but he also does quite a service to them, and this movie certainly does that for me.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that.
So you don't have Cape Fear, right?
No, no, there are probably a number I would put before I put Cape Fear.
Gotcha.
Not that I don't like it. There's just a lot of quality to root through here.
Yeah, I mean, on a different day, I might not have it on there for whatever reason. I was feeling it today. Just the high octane, anxiety ridden mess of that movie is the scariness of like De Niro's crocodilic face in that and all his tattoos.
Yeah, I his performance is excellent. I don't know if I buy everybody else in that movie.
That is very fair.
Like Nick Nolte is fine.
Yeah, there are a lot of true things about that statement. Silence, because you have silence at coming in at 8 or 7, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 7.
I find that movie very inspiring in a lot of ways. The overall ethos of that movie and the way it's told is really, as you said, meditative on many levels.
Yeah, not a commercial success, that one.
Andrew Garfield and Liam Neeson, right?
Yep, and Adam Driver.
Right. Adam Driver. Forgot about him.
Yeah, and there are a number of other I think primarily Japanese actors in it.
That movie
Um,
was shot in Taiwan, was it not?
yes.
Yeah, that's right. I remember finding that out when I was in Taiwan, which was really wild. All right.
Yeah, and it was a movie where I think he'd been waiting to shoot it for like 20 years and it just never worked out until later. And I think the length of time it took to make it kind of colors what sort of movie it ends up being.
Certainly, he definitely approaches that in a more, as you said, like wizened, mature, older man's perspective. Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, I just think that's the greatest. Just the greatest adventure movie ever made.
It's pretty
No holds bar, all gas, lit from the beginning to the end.
lit from one man's torch because he can't see anything, trying to maintain archaeological findings.
Dr. Jones.
Yeah, the time period of that, it almost takes on a life of its own in a lot of ways. It really draws you into that time period, into that character, into the even all of the other characters.
It just mixes a few things together super well. Like it mixes together both the idea of like this belongs in a museum, like preservation, but it mixes that with, the American hero and swashbuckling action. And then, in the face of the Nazis, it just makes everything that he does more justifiable.
And the frame narrative of the underlying love story continuing.
Yeah, the B story with the love story is fine.
Oh, I'm not saying it's great. It just draws in everyone. Like it's a movie that anyone could watch and get something out of. That's basically what I mean.
Oh yeah, I should hope. If nothing else other than just like complete entertainment.
Then Goodfellas, for me. Speaking of a movie that most people would probably get something out of, obviously it's a little bit more male centric. I mean, most of these are probably more male centric. Uh, but Goodfellas definitely is. From the scene of dear God, the iconic scene of them burying the guy in the woods.
Yeah.
The lighting of that scene in particular is just so grossly constructed.
Billy Bats.
Yeah. Like there's like a bunch of mist in the woods and the lights are shining from the car and they're all well lit. They're all sweating profusely. It's gross, it's muddy, it's bloody, it's gangster. What more can you say?
Yeah, if the first two Godfather movies are like the perfected version of like the drama of mob life, then Goodfellas is like just the next stage. Like it draws you in, it forces you to be like on par with Henry Hill, and you want to succeed in this world as much as he does before, the rugs keep getting pulled out from under him until you're as scared of
The
Robert De Niro's
helicopters.
Jimmy character as he is. Yeah, not only afraid of the law, but then becoming afraid of his own friend, as his friend kills all of their associates.
Right. Speaking of fear, Jaws, an absolutely iconic blending of natural the natural being utterly terrifying and then music and what you can do with music in a movie, how iconic you can create it, how you can make the character how you can make music a character that influences everyone in the entire movie.
Yeah, it's funny that we've talked this long and we've mentioned, Thelma Schumacher, um, or Schoonmaker, sorry, Thelma Schoonmaker, the editor of Scorsese's movies, but we haven't mentioned John Williams, who's,
Oh boy.
as critical a component to Spielberg's filmmaking as anyone else might be.
Yeah, his movies, I don't want to say they wouldn't be anything without him, but the depth that is there is undeniable. And yeah, Thelma Schoonmaker, for those who don't know, is Scorsese's editor for pretty much all of his movies. And the signs of a great editor is that you don't notice the edits. I forget who said that, but
What's his name?
it's one key to editing is you don't notice that they're not jarring. They just kind of take you
That
along.
guy, the guy who edited Apocalypse Now. That's one of his quotes. I forget his name though.
But yeah, anyway, Jaws, the zooms, the this movie I think perfectly encapsulates Spielberg as well, being that sort of bridge between adolescence and adulthood, sort of a movie made for teens, a movie that is both pleasurable because of the story, but also pleasurable because it's terrifying. It is theme park ride ish, but it is a film, which I think is one of the reasons why this stands out really well.
Yeah, and that might be something we have a whole episode on later. Is the attempts by a handful of filmmakers to turn movies into theme park rides, and I would say that genesis is owed pretty exclusively to Spielberg. Um, just with Jurassic Park, literally it's about a theme park, and the movie is kind of a ride.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's definitely that. He has a way of like synesthesia where you're watching on screen, but then also like you're with the character, but you're experiencing a lot of the same things that they are. Blends it all together.
Oh yeah, I mean, in terms of like one hallmark of what a director does is blocking shots, like choosing what ends up in the frame. And Spielberg has basically made a living off of being incredible at that. Like I would put him up there with Hitchcock as like one of the best like blocking directors ever.
There we go. We're doing more of a service to Spielberg for all the shit talking that has
I mean,
happened.
the man did make Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. He
Right.
did make Ready Player One, and those are definitely blemishes.
I love how you're inherently causing a schism with our audience. Anyone who likes Ready Player One.
I would love to be explained why I should give it more credit.
We'll just have to see. Taxi Driver. Talk about an incredible screenplay. Talk about a movie that the first time you see it, you may not get it. Talk about a movie that is jarring in many different ways, and also extremely surprising that it is a filmmaker's one of their first forays into movies.
Oh yeah, I mean it's funny that we went this long not mentioning John Williams. It's just egregious that we didn't mention Paul Schrader and the
Mm-hmm.
4 Scorsese movies he wrote, which obviously I think Taxi Driver is the best one, but he also wrote Raging Bull, The Last Temptation of Christ, and Bringing Out the Dead, which unfortunately neither of us have seen, but
Bring out your dead.
yeah, for all those interested, Bringing Out the Dead is some kind of crazy movie directed by Scorsese, written by Paul Schrader, starring Nick Cage.
Oh boy.
Yeah. As an ambulance
we
driver.
we should probably wait to watch that together, honestly.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't have too much to add about Taxi Driver in terms of like the psychological study of a man under duress due to trauma, PTSD, hypermodernization, and the filth of a city doesn't get much better.
culturally, its ramifications run very deep for America as well as American characters, and there have been, I would say, a number of iterations of Taxi Driver or attempts in many different ways to have a story similar to it. um, The Departed.
Yeah, I just like I basically view there being a through line from like The Godfather and then Goodfellas and The Departed, even though The Departed may not seem too
Hmm.
similar to either of those two. I view it as being some kind of a ancestor.
Certainly, I never thought about that, but that is certainly true. Uh, the Departed's motley of different characters, of their objectives, and then how they continually cross, double cross, triple cross each other. Does it in a different way than Goodfellas and The Departed, but it has the same sort of towering characters, the same level of violence, corruption, and greed that continue to pervade American society and then ultimately lead to the downfall of everyone at the hands
Yeah,
of
everybody.
at the hands of everyone. Most iconically, Mr. Marky Mark himself,
The Doler of Justice.
and then fading into the Boston day with a Ratatouille.
Yeah, a very silly ending.
So remind me again, you had number one as Taxi Driver, right?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, just making sure. And then Schindler's List. As we talked about, both of these directors are extremely interested in history, and they do a lot of justice, I would say, in making people interested in history, but also capturing what a moment in time was like, what a character in that time was like, and then also the ramifications of this historical place. I mean, at least for me, one of the reasons I am more interested in history now than ever before is because of film. But yeah, Schindler's List, about we talked about Come and See. I would put Come and See very very high up there, but Schindler's List is definitely as realistic a Holocaust movie as I have seen. Just with the brutality, the interaction between characters, the the lows of that, and there aren't highs in it, but there's sort of like within this situation, there is something that can be done. Is certainly a theme of that movie, right? Whatever situation you're handed, no matter how dark it is, there's something that you can do for someone, which is very powerful.
Yeah, and I think it helps that the ending of the movie is very reverent towards the material. Like the stuff at the graveyard.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Um, but yeah, I don't think I have too much more to say. I guess one thing I would say is of these, just as a generalized note, even though these are two of my favorite filmmakers, and we kind of compared how much we like each of their movies. I don't think any of these would be in my, if I had to make a list of my 10 favorite movies, I don't think any of these would even make it on that.
Taxi Driver wouldn't.
It might, depending on the day.
Yeah, I mean, on my top 25 list, I think I have two of these. But yeah, The rest are kind of spread out. I agree. I think they have a lot of long lasting um, works. Um, but yeah, there are certainly films out there that I hold in higher regard. But then again, American cinema would not be anything without these two, or it'd be a different thing. Rather, it would be a different thing. Just more so what I mean.
Oh yeah, I mean they've helped establish it for what it is today, and continue to make their mark in different ways. We'll see. Maybe there are people who think that Spielberg's remake of West Side Story is an enduring piece of cinema, but
Will only
I sure doubt it.
will only only time will tell. Well, that should do her.
Yeah.
So brings the close of the Spielberg Scorsese Art Fisher Brothers podcast. Till next time. Adios.
Adios.